It was a chilly fall evening. A drizzling rain had turned the fallen leaves into a slippery carpet. Allison Harvey, a high school teacher, had been trying to fight off a fever with home remedies for 3 days. The thermometer read 39.5 comma, and even the slightest movement of her head sent a dull ache through her entire body. Dean, her husband, came home around 10 o'clock. He smelled of motor oil and someone else's cologne, probably stuck at the auto shop again. He glanced at his wife lying under 2 blankets and frowned. "Still sick? Maybe you should stop trying to treat yourself." Allison wanted to protest. She couldn't stand hospitals, but a new coughing fit cut her off mid-sentence. The cough was deep, wrenching her lungs. "That's it. Get ready. I'm calling an ambulance," Dean said, taking out his phone, his voice taking on a commanding tone. 40 minutes later, Allison was sitting in the emergency room of the city hospital. The doctor, an elderly man with a neatly trimmed gray beard, listened carefully to her lungs and shook his head. "Double pneumonia, Mrs. Harvey. You'll have to stay here." The ward was for 4, but 3 beds were free. An elderly woman was dozing in the corner by the window. Allison settled down against the opposite wall, mechanically noting the scuffs on the linoleum and the yellowish stains on the ceiling. The nurse quickly set up an IV and left, leaving the patient alone with the steady hum of the hospital corridors. Dean visited her the next day after lunch. He brought oranges and a bottle of mineral water and sat down on the edge of the bed. "How are you? What do the doctors say?" "I'll live." Allison tried to smile. "They gave me antibiotics and an IV. They say I'll have to stay in bed for 2 weeks. 2 weeks?" Something like encouragement slipped into her husband's voice, but he immediately frowned. "That's a long time. What about your lessons?" The head teacher promised to find a replacement. "Everyone understands. Health is more important." Dean nodded and took out his phone, quickly scrolling through some messages. Allison watched him from under half-closed eyelids. In 15 years of marriage, she had learned to notice the slightest changes in his behavior. Something was wrong. Usually caring, he now seemed distracted, as if his thoughts were somewhere far away. "By the way, I was thinking," he put his phone in his pocket, "maybe while you're here, I'll have a garage sale. We've been wanting to get rid of some junk for a while. I'll start renovating the living room at the same time. You won't get in the way with your 'don't touch my books.'" Allison raised her eyebrows in surprise. They had never discussed a garage sale or renovations. And what junk! Every item in their house was functional and necessary. "Maybe we should wait until I get back," she suggested cautiously. "We should decide together." "You know, it's quiet in my studio right now. It's the perfect time to do some work around the house," Dean said, getting up. "Okay, I have to go. I'll stop by tomorrow." He leaned down to kiss her forehead, hastily, almost formally. He smelled of someone else's cologne again, and the scent seemed vaguely familiar to Allison. The next few days dragged on slowly. IVs, injections, temperature checks. Her roommate was quiet, spending most of her time staring out the window or dozing. Dean stopped by briefly, always after work, always in a hurry. His visits became like a ritual. He would sit down on the edge of the bed, ask how she was feeling, tell her something insignificant about work, and kiss her goodbye. On the 5th day, Allison noticed that as he was leaving, he stopped in the hallway near the nurse's station. She couldn't make out the words, but his posture, the way he leaned forward slightly, resting his hand on the counter, suggested an informal conversation. A woman's laughter reached the ward, and Allison recognized the voice. It was the ward administrator, Sandra, she thought. A tall blonde with perfect makeup, she often passed by the ward, her heels clicking on the hallway floor. Allison closed her eyes. Her fever had finally broken, and her thoughts were clearer. Something had changed in her relationship with Dean over the past year. She couldn't say exactly when it had started, Maybe when he decided to expand his workshop and started staying late, or maybe when she took on extra hours at school to help students prepare for their exams. It was as if they had started moving along parallel lines, further and further apart. She couldn't sleep that night. Rain rustled outside the window, and nurses whispered softly in the hallway. Allison thought about home, about her class, about the book she hadn't finished reading on her nightstand, and about why her husband's cologne smelled so familiar. She could have sworn she had smelled it here, in the hospital, but she couldn't remember where. After a week in the hospital, Allison had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the morning routine. At 7 o'clock sharp, the nurse would arrive with a thermometer, followed half an hour later by an IV, then breakfast. She had learned to distinguish between the footsteps of the staff. The nurses walked quickly and lightly, the doctors sedately, and Sandra Osborne's heels tapped out a distinctive rhythm in the hallway, clear and confident. That morning, Sandra entered the ward for the first time. Allison was trying to reach a book that had fallen when she heard the familiar click of heels and the rustle of a starched gown. "Let me help you." Sandra bent down for the book, and Allison caught that same scent of perfume, light, slightly spicy, with a hint of vanilla. "Oh, Fitzgerald, I love the classics." Her smile was flawless, as was her entire appearance, perfectly styled blonde hair, skillfully accentuated eyes, and pastel-colored manicure. It seemed strange to see so much glamour within the walls of a hospital. "Thank you." Allison took the book, feeling unexpectedly irritated. "You're the ward administrator, right?" "Yes, I'm Sandra. I decided to check on you myself. Your husband is very concerned about your condition." Something in the way she said, "your husband," made Allison wary. A slight carelessness in her tone, excessive softness. She couldn't quite put her finger on what it was that bothered her. "Does Dean often ask the staff about my health?" "Oh, yes. He's very attentive." Sandra sat down on the edge of the empty bed next to her. "Yesterday we discussed your treatment at length. You know, pneumonia is a tricky thing. You have to see it through to the end." Allison remembered her husband's visit yesterday. He had stayed for 15 minutes at most, citing urgent work. Apparently, that urgent work included conversations with the impressive administrator. A nurse with an IV stand peeked into the room, and Sandra stood up. "Get well soon, Mrs. Harvey. If you need anything, let us know." She floated out of the room, leaving behind a trail of perfume and a vague sense of unease. Allison stared at the IV clip, absent-mindedly watching the drops fall, and remembered how she had met Dean. 15 years ago, he had repaired her old Ford, and his hands smelled of motor oil rather than expensive perfume. They were young, full of hope, and the future seemed clear and bright. After lunch, Dean arrived. He was carrying a bag of fruit and the latest issue of a magazine. "How are you today?" He leaned down to kiss her on the cheek, and Allison caught the familiar scent again. "Better. I met your administrator, Sandra." She watched his reaction closely, but Dean just shrugged. "Oh, yeah. She's a smart woman. She helps with the paperwork." "What paperwork?" "Well, insurance. All kinds of paperwork." He looked away and began smoothing out a crease in the bedspread. "Listen, I've been thinking about renovations. Maybe we should replace all the furniture in the living room. You have money in your account, right?" The sudden change of subject was so obvious that Allison was taken aback. In 15 years of marriage, they had never discussed their money. Everything had always been shared. "Dean, what's going on?" "Nothing's going on." He took out his phone and quickly scrolled through his messages. "I just think it's time to redecorate. While you're here getting treatment, I could work on the house." Familiar heels clicked in the hallway, and Dean turned his head slightly at the sound. The movement was almost imperceptible, but Allison caught it. She also noticed how his breathing quickened slightly. "By the way, I'm going to be late home from the workshop today," he said, getting up. A client is bringing a car in after 8. You stay late every day. There's a lot of work. He leaned down for his usual kiss on her forehead. Get well soon. Allison watched him walk toward the door with his characteristic gait, slightly hunched over, his hands tucked into his jeans pockets. In the hallway, he stopped at the nurse's station and she could hear Sandra's soft conversation and laughter. Her roommate, a quiet, elderly woman, suddenly spoke up. You know, girl, I've been a nurse for 30 years, and I remember that laugh well. That's how people laugh when they want to be liked. Allison didn't answer. She looked out the window at the drizzling rain and thought about how strange life was. Everything seemed normal, but one small detail, one wrong note, and the whole picture began to fall apart, revealing what she didn't want to see. In the evening, when the lights were turned off in the ward, she lay awake for a long time, replaying the events of the last few months in her head. Dean had started staying late at work more often and talking less, as if he had withdrawn into himself. She put it down to fatigue. The workshop was demanding a lot of energy. Or maybe she should have taken a closer look. Rain rustled outside the window again. Somewhere deep in the hospital corridors, nurses were talking, instruments were beeping, and wheelchairs were rustling. The usual hospital sounds that had become so familiar over the past week. Just as familiar as the click of Sandra's heels, her soft laughter, her distinctive gait, and the scent of her perfume on Dean's shirt. The morning medication had tired Allison, and she dozed off. In her half-sleep, the hospital ward merged with memories from 15 years ago, an old Ford with a stalled engine, a roadside repair shop on the outskirts of town, a young mechanic in an oil-stained jumpsuit. That day she was rushing to a school interview and hadn't expected the car to break down. Dean came out of the garage, wiping his hands on a rag, and smiled openly, boyishly. Don't worry, miss. We'll fix it. She remembered sitting on a bench outside the workshop, watching him work and feeling calm and right for the first time in a long time. He fixed the car in an hour, refused to take any money, and only asked for her phone number. Allison was surprised. She was wearing an old jumper, no makeup, and her hair was a mess. But he looked at her as if he saw something special. Their first date was at a simple diner. Dean talked about his dream of opening his own workshop, and she talked about her desire to teach children literature. They talked until closing time, and the waitress hinted several times that it was time to leave, but they didn't care. Allison turned on the hospital bed, trying to get more comfortable. Memories came flooding back. Their first trip together out of town, where they spent the whole day walking through the autumn forest. Dean picked her up and carried her across streams, and she laughed and snuggled against his shoulder. In the evening, they roasted marshmallows over a campfire and made plans for the future. The wedding was modest. A few friends, their parents, a simple white dress. They spent their honeymoon on the road, taking a tent and driving wherever their eyes took them. They spent the nights on the shores of lakes, had breakfast in roadside cafes, and Dean held her hand the whole time, as if afraid she would disappear. The first few years flew by like a single day. They bought a small house on the outskirts of town, old and in need of repair, but it was theirs. In the evenings, Dean repaired the leaky roof, and Allison painted the walls. On weekends, they went shopping together, choosing furniture and curtains. Every item in the house held memories of their life together. The sofa they bought with Allison's first prize money from school. The kitchen set they spent a whole week putting together. The bookshelves Dean built himself. Dean worked hard saving up for his own workshop. Allison supported him as best she could, taking extra hours at school and tutoring on the side. When he finally opened his business, they celebrated all night, sitting on the porch, drinking wine and dreaming about the future. The workshop grew and gained customers. Dean stayed late more and more often, but Allison understood that his business required time and effort. She was busy with school, her students, and preparing for lessons. Imperceptibly, their evenings together became less frequent, their conversations shorter. 3 years ago, something broke. Maybe it was fatigue. They both worked a lot. Maybe it was the routine. Every day was like the one before. Or maybe they just stopped noticing each other amid their daily concerns. Allison remembered the evening when she first felt alienated. She had prepared a special dinner, the anniversary of their first meeting. Dean came home late, ate quickly, and buried himself in his phone. She tried to talk about the past, but he just nodded distractedly, lost in his own thoughts. Gradually, they began to live their own lives. Dean spent more and more nights in his workshop explaining that he had urgent work to do. Allison immersed herself in schoolwork, preparing for exams, extracurricular activities, endless tests. They had become like neighbors who happened to share a house. The bedside table in the hospital room was covered with medicines. Allison looked at the labels, remembering how Dean used to take care of her when she was sick, bringing her hot tea with honey, reading aloud, just sitting next to her. Now his visits were short and formal, as if he were fulfilling a duty. Outside the window, the city bustled with cars, voices, and snatches of music. Somewhere out there was their workshop, their home, their past life. I wonder, Allison thought, when exactly did the smell of machine oil on Dean's shirt give way to the scent of women's perfume? When did his gaze, once so attentive and warm, begin to slip past her? When had their conversations turned into an exchange of pleasantries? Her roommate quietly turned on the radio. Old melodies, gentle and a little sad. Allison remembered their first dance at their wedding, awkward, happy, full of hope. Dean had stepped on her foot and apologized profusely, and she had laughed and kissed him, ignoring the guests. 15 years is a long time. They had grown up, changed, become different people. Maybe it was normal for feelings to fade and dreams to give way to everyday worries. But then, why did it hurt so much to see Dean lingering at the nurse's station, to hear women laughing in the hallway, to smell a strange perfume on his shirt? The nurse brought his evening medication. Dusk was gathering outside the window, and the ward was getting cool. Allison pulled the blanket up higher, wondering what Dean was doing now. Was he really in the workshop? Or maybe he was sitting in some cafe, looking into the eyes of a woman who smelled of vanilla and betrayal. The hospital treatments were gradually helping. Allison could already sit up in bed and even walk around the ward a little. Her neighbor had been discharged, and now she passed the time alone, doing crossword puzzles and reading old magazines. That morning, she ventured out into the hospital garden for the first time. The nurse helped her dress warmly and accompanied her to a bench under an old maple tree. The leaves had almost all fallen, but the weather was surprisingly warm for mid-autumn. "Not too long, okay?" the nurse warned her. "And if anything happens, call me right away." Allison nodded, wrapping herself more tightly in her wool cardigan. From the open window on the second floor came the sounds of the hospital, voices, footsteps, the beeping of instruments. She closed her eyes, turning her face to the faint autumn sun when she heard a familiar voice. "Yes, this afternoon," Dean was talking on the phone, apparently standing by that very window. "No, she doesn't know. What does it matter? The main thing is to get everything out while she's here." Allison froze, afraid to move. The wind carried snippets of the conversation. "The sofa can go to the workshop. Yes, and the bookshelves too. No, leave the appliances for now. Listen, I can't talk long. I'll be there in half an hour." A pause. Then his voice again, quieter. "Yes, Sandra, I remember the documents. Everything will be fine. Don't worry." Allison exhaled slowly. There was a lump in her throat, but she forced herself to sit still. An elderly couple walked slowly along the garden paths. Cars honked in the distance. "What are you doing here?" Dean appeared unexpectedly, as if he had materialized out of thin air. "You're not supposed to be out for long." "The doctor said I could." She looked up, staring intently at her husband. "You're early today." "Yes, I decided to come by early." He sat down next to her and took out his phone. "I have some news. I started renovating the living room. I had to move some things out of the way." "What exactly?" "Just a few things," he shrugged. "Mostly old junk." Allison remembered their sofa, comfortable, with soft cushions, bought with her first teaching bonus. The bookshelves that Dean had made himself, carefully selecting the wood and varnish. "Junk?" "You know," she adjusted her cardigan, "I was thinking, maybe we shouldn't start renovating right now. Let's wait until spring." "No, now's the time," he interrupted. "While you're here, I'll do everything. It'll be a surprise." "I don't like surprises." Dean was silent, staring at his phone. A message flashed on the screen and Allison caught the sender's name. Sandra. "It's time to go back to your room," he said, getting up. "It's getting cold. Do you need me to walk you?" "I'll be fine." She walked slowly down the hospital corridors, leaning against the wall. Fragments of the conversation she had overheard were spinning around in her head. Get it out while she's here. The documents. Sandra. The ward was quiet and cool. Allison crawled under the blanket and took out her phone. The banking app showed her usual balance, her teaching salary and a small savings account. She couldn't check their joint account. Only Dean had access to it. Towards evening, a nurse came in with an IV. "Isn't Sandra working today?" Allison asked casually. "No, she took the day off," the nurse replied, deftly inserting the needle. "Personal reasons," they said. "Personal business. I wonder if that includes moving furniture out of someone else's house." Allison watched the medicine drip slowly and thought about how strange life was. Just a week ago, everything seemed clear and familiar, and now every word, every gesture was filled with new meaning. She heard footsteps in the hallway. Someone was rolling a cart with dinner. It smelled like hospital food and medicine. Outside, it was getting dark and the city lights were coming on. Somewhere out there, their house was empty and quiet. Or was it? Her phone vibrated softly. A message from Dean. "I won't be home tonight. Too much work. Get some rest." Allison put her phone on the nightstand. She remembered the day when she and Dean had chosen their sofa. They had probably visited a dozen stores before finding the right one. "We'll read and watch movies here," he had said then. "This is our family sofa." I wonder how she and Sandra got it out of the store. They probably hired movers. And where did they put all the books from the shelves? The ones they had collected over the years, given to each other as gifts, and discussed on long winter evenings. Footsteps sounded in the hallway again. One of the staff was making their evening rounds. Allison closed her eyes, pretending to be asleep. She didn't want to talk to anyone. She didn't want to think about the empty living room, about the betrayal, about what would happen next. She just wanted to lie in the dark and listen to the autumn wind rustling outside the window, tearing the last leaves from the hospital maple tree. Hospital days followed their own special schedule. At 6 in the morning, the cleaning lady washed the corridors, her bucket clinking. At 6:30, they distributed thermometers, and at 7, the first medications and IVs. Breakfast was brought at exactly 8, and Allison had already learned to tell the time by the sound of the trolley wheels rumbling across the tiled floor. That morning, she woke up earlier than usual because of the stuffiness in the ward. The night nurse had forgotten to open the window, and Allison, wrapped in her hospital gown, carefully got out of bed. After a week of treatment, her weakness had almost disappeared, only her head was still spinning sometimes. There was an old visitor's chair by the window, and she settled into it, watching the sky lighten through the glass. The hospital courtyard gradually came to life. The first cars arrived, nurses hurried to their shifts, and somewhere below, the janitor swept up fallen leaves. Voices could be heard in the corridor. The nurses were gathering in the doctor's office before the shift change. Allison already knew this morning routine: discussion of difficult patients, assignment of duties, and of course, the inevitable hospital gossip. Can you believe it? I walked in at noon yesterday and there was Sandra. She said she brought the patient's documents at 10 o'clock last night. The night nurse's voice sounded muffled, but in the morning silence the words were clearly audible. At 10. Wasn't Dean Harvey supposed to pick her up? Exactly. He waits for her in the parking lot every evening thinking no one notices. And his wife is here, in room 32. You know, she's so quiet, always reading books. Allison froze in her chair. Her heart was pounding in her ears. When I saw them together for the first time, I knew right away. He pretends to be visiting his wife, but he's actually whispering to Sandra by the bed. They discuss some documents, then just stand there laughing. Sandra says he's helping her open a car repair shop. Passing on his experience, she says. Yeah, experience. I saw what kind of experience he was passing on to her in the car yesterday, right in the back parking lot, thinking no one would notice. The sound of a door opening interrupted the conversation. The stern voice of the head nurse giving out instructions for the day could be heard. Allison sat motionless, feeling cold sweat running down her back. The day dragged on endlessly. The familiar hospital sounds, the shuffling of slippers in the hallway, the beeping of instruments, the rustling of IVs, now seemed hollow and alien. Allison mechanically ate tasteless oatmeal, obediently swallowed her pills, and answered the doctor's questions during rounds. After lunch, a young nurse came into the ward to change the IV. She worked silently, carefully avoiding the patient's gaze. Voices could be heard again in the hallway, this time from the orderlies delivering clean linen. I'm telling you, they meet every evening. She brings him coffee to the workshop and cooks his meals. How can that be? The man's wife is in the hospital and they... What about Sandra? She's used to it. Last year she was also involved with a married man while his wife was in intensive care. By evening it had started to rain. Drops drummed on the tin eaves and thunder rumbled in the distance. Allison lay staring at the ceiling, remembering all the strange things that had happened in recent weeks. Her husband's hurried visits, his constant tardiness and excuses, the smell of another woman's perfume on his shirt. At 9 o'clock, the night nurse peeked into the ward. Your husband called and said he won't be coming today. Urgent work at the workshop. Yes, of course. Allison even managed to smile. He's been very busy lately. The nurse hesitated at the door, clearly wanting to say something but changed her mind and left. Voices sounded again in the corridor. The staff was getting ready for the night shift. The hospital never really slept. One rhythm simply replaced another. Rain pattered outside the window. Somewhere deep inside the hospital, a phone rang insistently. In the next room, someone moaned softly in their sleep. These were the usual nighttime sounds that Allison had grown accustomed to. Only now they seemed different, as if the hospital world had split into a before and after the conversation she had overheard. In the silence, she could clearly hear the clock ticking on the wall, minute after minute, hour after hour. I wonder, thought Allison, looking at the steadily swaying hand, how many nights Sandra had spent with her husband while she lay here, trustingly swallowing her prescribed medication. The morning rounds were taking a long time. The young intern listened to Allison's lungs for a long time, frowned, and made notes in her chart. Outside the window, rain was drizzling, and the drops on the glass blurred the outlines of the hospital courtyard. How's the renovation going? The doctor asked perfunctorily while the intern fiddled with his stethoscope. My husband is working on it, Allison shrugged. He says he wants to surprise me. At that moment, a nurse peeked into the ward. Mrs. Harvey, you have a phone call. Your husband is asking for you. The nurse's station was empty. It was lunchtime. Allison picked up the phone, wrinkling her nose at the smell of hospital disinfectant. Hi, Dean's voice sounded unusually cheerful. Listen, here's the thing. I decided to start with the living room. Remember how you said you were tired of those old chairs? I didn't say that. Yes, you did, last year. Anyway, I've already taken them out. And the coffee table, too. It was wobbly anyway. Allison closed her eyes. The armchairs had been a housewarming gift from her parents. Comfortable, with high backs, perfect for reading. They had chosen the table together, spending a whole weekend looking for the right one. And I got rid of the bookcase with the photos, Dean continued. It was just taking up space. The bookcase held their wedding photos, pictures from their travels and photos of her students' graduations, 15 years of their life in a wooden frame. Where did you put all that? In the workshop for now. We'll decide later what to throw away and what to sell. There was a rustling in the receiver followed by a woman's voice, muffled but familiar. Dean hurriedly said goodbye. I have to go. A client is here. Allison slowly put down the phone. On the nurse's desk lay a fresh magazine, its cover featuring a smiling couple advertising home furnishings. Create your perfect space, read the headline. The ward was quiet and cool. The bed next to hers had already been made up with fresh sheets. A new patient was due to arrive after lunch. Allison took out her phone and opened her photo gallery. There was their living room, bright and cozy, with bookshelves lining the walls, armchairs by the window, a coffee table with teacups, a bookcase with photographs. The little world they had created together, which was now disappearing, piece by piece. In the evening, Dean called again. I was thinking maybe we should replace the sofa. It's kind of old-fashioned. That's my favorite sofa. It was your favorite. It's time for a change, don't you think? Music was playing behind him. He wasn't in his studio, and a woman's laughter, no longer even concealed. By the way, I packed up your books, he added casually. They're just gathering dust anyway. Books. Her teaching library, collected over years of work, rare editions, gifts from colleagues, worn volumes with notes in the margins. Dean, maybe you should wait with the repairs? I'll be discharged soon. No. The doctor said you have to stay in bed for at least 2 more weeks. I'll have time to do everything. It'll be a surprise. Nurses were delivering dinner in the hallway. It smelled of hospital food and evening medication. Allison looked out the window at the wet trees, trying to imagine her living room, empty, without armchairs or photographs, without books or mementos. Her new neighbor turned out to be talkative, an elderly woman who had undergone heart surgery. She talked at length about her grandchildren, showed her photos, and then suddenly asked, Are you renovating your house? I heard you and your husband talking. Yes, he decided to redecorate the living room. That's a good idea. Mine can't get his act together. He keeps putting it off. She said something else, but Allison wasn't listening anymore. She could see their living room in her mind's eye, just as it had been on that last morning before she went to the hospital. The sun shining on the book spines, her favorite armchair by the window, the photographs on the bookcase. I wonder where Dean put all that stuff. Really in the workshop, or... A thunderstorm broke out during the night. The thunder rumbled very close by, and lightning lit up the ward with a bright white light. Her neighbor snored quietly on her bunk. Allison lay awake, imagining what else would disappear tomorrow. Maybe the old records they had collected, or the box of postcards, or the album with photos of her students. Piece by piece, detail by detail. It was as if someone was methodically erasing all traces of her presence in her own home. Her phone vibrated quietly. A message from Dean. The workers are coming tomorrow to take down the wallpaper. Don't worry, I'll make sure everything's taken care of. They had chosen the wallpaper together, light gray with a subtle pattern. They had argued about the shades, consulted with the consultant, then hung it themselves, getting covered in glue and laughing at the uneven seams. Now that, too, would be a thing of the past, like the armchairs, books, and photographs. There was a particularly loud clap of thunder outside. The door in the hallway creaked. The night nurse was making her rounds. Somewhere deep in the hospital, a phone rang urgently. The usual nighttime sounds had become so familiar. Allison covered her head with a blanket, trying to hide from thoughts of the empty house and what was replacing the old, familiar things. That day, the familiar hospital silence was broken by the ringing voice of a new intern. Her name was Melanie, and she had arrived at the ward just a week ago. Very young, with freckles on her nose and a mane of red hair peeking out from under her uniform cap. Allison was looking through her medical records. She had received new test results that morning. Something about the numbers seemed strange, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. "Let me help you with the IV," Melanie said, already settling in next to her, deftly changing the bag of solution. "Oh, are you studying the test results? I'm writing a paper on pneumonia." "Really?" Allison moved the chart closer. "Then maybe you can explain something to me. Here, in the blood test." Melanie leaned over the papers and her freckled face suddenly became serious. "That's strange. According to all indicators, you showed significant improvement a week ago, but for some reason, in the latest tests—" "What?" "It's none of my business, of course," the intern stammered, fidgeting with the sleeve of her lab coat. "But the numbers are wrong. It's as if—" Footsteps sounded in the hallway, and Melanie hurriedly straightened up. Sandra appeared in the doorway, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, smelling of familiar perfume. "Melanie, you're wanted in the treatment room." Her voice sounded cool. "I'll take care of Mrs. Harvey's documents myself." When the intern closed the door behind her, Sandra reached for the medical chart. "I'll take this. I need to make some changes." "But I wanted to—" "Rest, Mrs. Harvey. You need to gather your strength." In the evening, Melanie peeked into the ward again, pretending to check the IV. Waiting for her neighbor to doze off, she sat down on the edge of the bed and whispered, "I looked at your previous test results. There are obvious discrepancies. You see, with pneumonia, certain indicators should change consistently, but yours are all over the place. It's as if someone is tampering with them." Melanie nodded, glancing nervously at the door. "I know I shouldn't talk about this, but it's been happening lately, especially with documents that go through Sandra? I can't prove anything." The intern lowered her voice even further. "But last week there was a case with Mrs. Thompson's medical records. She was kept here an extra month because of some strange results, and then she overheard her husband." There was a click of heels in the hallway, and Melanie hurriedly stood up. "I have to go, but I'll keep an eye on your test results." The next morning, Allison asked the doctor to show her the latest test results during his rounds. The young doctor raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Strange. They're not in the file. Sandra should have filed them yesterday." "Maybe we should repeat the tests?" "I don't see the need. Judging by the previous results, you need at least 2 more weeks of treatment." In the evening, when Melanie came with the IV, Allison showed her the old results, which she had managed to photograph on her phone. "Look," the intern pointed to the numbers. "There should be an improvement here, but for some reason the numbers are worse. And these numbers are impossible given your condition. Can you prove it?" "Not formally. I'm just an intern." Melanie bit her lip. "But I can copy all the new results and keep track of where the originals go." Nurses were handing out dinner in the hallway. The smell of hospital food and medicine filled the air. Outside the window, the autumn day was coming to an end, and in the gathering twilight, the hospital garden seemed unreal, like a set in a shadow theater. Melanie adjusted the IV. "My mom is a teacher too, and when my dad— Anyway, I know what it's like to know something's wrong but not be able to prove it." Allison squeezed her hand gratefully. At that moment, the head nurse peeked into the ward. "Melanie, come to the doctor's office. Sandra wants to talk to you." The intern paled but quickly pulled herself together. "I'll check back in later. I'll check the IV." That night, Allison couldn't sleep for a long time. The numbers from the tests, snippets of conversations, and strange inconsistencies in the documents were spinning around in her head. Somewhere deep in the hospital, a phone rang insistently, and in the next room, someone moaned softly in their sleep. Rain rustled outside the window and drops formed strange patterns on the glass, like numbers in fake test results, like traces of someone else's manipulation of her life. Allison found an unexpected advantage in the hospital routine. No one paid any attention to a patient who spent her time reading by the window in the hall. The open book made it easy to watch the nurses station, especially Sandra working with the documents. Melanie proved to be an indispensable assistant. Every time she brought medicine, she accidentally dropped some papers, and Allison managed to photograph them on her phone. Gradually, a picture emerged. The test results were changed after the laboratory sent them to the ward. "Look," Melanie whispered, furtively showing her the original printouts from the lab. "And this is what appears in your chart after the documents pass through Sandra." The numbers were different, not by much but enough to justify longer treatment. Allison remembered her husband's words well. "You need to get completely better." That day, Allison noticed a strange commotion at the nurses' station. Sandra was hurriedly explaining something to an elderly doctor, waving some papers. Allison caught snippets of phrases. "Special case. Requires extended treatment. Complications may be unpredictable." That evening, Melanie brought copies of these documents, a conclusion that 2 more weeks of inpatient treatment were necessary. The handwriting in some of the columns seemed familiar to Allison. "That's Dr. Baker's handwriting," she remarked. "But he's been on vacation for a week." Melanie nodded. "I saw Sandra take out some old documents with his signature on them, and then she spent a long time practicing copying them." Allison asked her to bring her some blank test forms, ostensibly to get a better understanding of the results. Melanie got them from the lab, and now they were lying in the bedside table, hidden under some books. The opportunity arose the following Tuesday. Sandra left the folder with the documents at her desk when she was urgently called to another department. Allison, who was sitting in the hall with a book, managed to take several photos. Among the papers, she found a draft with practice signatures, almost perfect copies of Dr. Baker's signature. Melanie didn't waste any time either. She had befriended a lab assistant and could now compare the original test results with those that appeared in the medical records. The discrepancies were becoming more and more noticeable. "They're not even trying to hide it," the intern said indignantly. "They probably think no one will check." On Thursday, Allison got lucky again. She overheard Sandra talking on the phone. She was standing by the window at the far end of the corridor and speaking loudly enough for Allison to make out the words. "Yes, Dean, everything's ready. 2 more weeks at least. No, don't worry. I checked everything. The signatures are perfect." Allison took out her phone and turned on the voice recorder. The recording quality wasn't great, but the words were clear enough. By the end of the week, she had accumulated a whole collection of photos of documents, recordings of conversations, and copies of test results. Melanie helped her organize everything and even drew up a chart showing how the indicators had changed in the different versions of the test results. "You know," said the intern, looking at the papers spread out on the table, "I was in the lab yesterday when your new test results came in. According to them, you're practically healthy. What's in the chart? The numbers are completely different, and 3 more tests have been ordered." Allison carefully put the documents back in the envelope. Rain was drizzling outside the window, and the drops on the glass blurred the outline of the hospital garden. Somewhere out there, behind the fence, Dean continued to remove things from their home, methodically erasing all traces of their life together. And here, in the hospital, Sandra was just as methodically forging documents to extend her stay. In the evening, Dean called. "Hi, how are you feeling?" "Better. I think I'll be able to get out soon." No. The doctors say you need at least 2 more weeks. You can't risk your health." There was a poorly concealed anxiety in his voice. I wonder, Allison thought, is he really worried about her health, or is he just trying to buy time? At night, when the ward had quieted down, she took out her phone and looked over the evidence she had gathered once more. Photos of documents, recordings of conversations, copies of test results, little pieces of truth that were coming together to form a bigger picture. How could she piece together these scattered clues into something that would force both of them, Dean and Sandra, to answer for their actions? Night nurses whispered in the hallway, water dripped somewhere, and the wind rustled the leaves outside the window. The usual hospital sounds had become so familiar. Allison closed her eyes, listening to this nocturnal symphony and thinking that sometimes the most important battles are won not by force, but by patience and attention to detail. The morning was cloudy, with heavy clouds hanging over the hospital garden promising more rain. Allison was sitting by the window in the hall when she heard a familiar voice. Jane Mitchell, Dean's best friend's wife, was standing at the nurse's station, filling out some paperwork. She had obviously come to visit her mother, who was lying on the floor above. Jane noticed Allison and hesitated, as if wondering whether to approach her or pretend she hadn't recognized her. Finally, plucking up her courage, she approached, fidgeting with her purse. "Allison, how are you feeling?" "Better, thank you. How's Tom?" "He's fine." "Yes, everything's fine." Jane was clearly uncomfortable. "Listen, I'm in a hurry. My mother is waiting." She had already turned to leave, but suddenly stopped. "You know, I have something to tell you. Tom wouldn't approve, but anyway, Dean came to see us yesterday. He was seeking advice about divorce." Allison slowly put the book down on her lap. The hall was quiet. Only the distant clinking of dishes from the sideboard could be heard. "Tom tried to talk him out of it, though," Jane added hastily. "He said he needed to discuss it with you first, but Dean's made up his mind. He said he's filing next week." "While I was in the hospital?" "Yes, and also," Jane lowered her voice, "he's already found an apartment. Apparently he's moving in with some woman, an administrator from the hospital." At that moment, Sandra appeared from around the corner, her makeup flawless, her heels clicking on the tile floor. Jane fell silent, frightened. "Mrs. Harvey, you can't sit in the lobby for long." Sandra's voice sounded professionally caring. "Let me take you to your room." "I have to go," Jane muttered. "Get well soon." She hurried away, and Allison slowly made her way back to her room, leaning against the wall. Fragments of the conversation spun around in her head. Divorce, apartment, next week. The day dragged on endlessly. IV, lunch, new medications. Her roommate tried to strike up a conversation, but Allison only nodded distractedly in response. Towards evening, Melanie popped in, sat down on the edge of the bed, pretending to check the IV. "I heard your conversation with Mrs. Mitchell. I'm sorry, I wasn't eavesdropping." "It's okay. Everyone will find out soon enough." "You know, Sandra was filling out some paperwork for an apartment yesterday." The intern lowered her voice. "I saw the papers on her desk. The address is on Maple Street." Maple Street, a cozy neighborhood with small coffee shops and antique stores. Dean and she often walked there on weekends, window shopping and making plans. Now he would be walking there with someone else. In the evening, Sarah, her colleague from school, called. "Allison, sorry to bother you. It's just... Anyway, Dean stopped by the school today. He picked up your things from the teacher's lounge." "What things?" "Books, some folders with notes. He said you asked him to. And also, he left a letter saying you were quitting, retroactive to when you got sick." Allison closed her eyes. The books from the staff room were her favorites, the ones she used to prepare her lessons, the notes she had compiled over the years, the lesson plan for the next semester. "I didn't sign any resignation letter." "I thought so," Sarah said sympathetically. "But it was your signature, very similar." very similar, like the ones on her medical records. Allison remembered how Sandra had practiced copying Dr. Baker's handwriting. I wonder how many more documents with forged signatures are waiting to be discovered. A thunderstorm broke out during the night. Lightning lit up the room with bright white flashes, and thunder rumbled close by. Allison lay awake, listening to the sound of rain and thinking about how methodically, step by step, she was being erased from her own life. Her home, her job, her future. Everything was falling apart like a house of cards while she lay there, swallowing the pills Sandra had prescribed. Night nurses whispered quietly in the hallway, and water dripped from a faulty faucet somewhere. The hospital went about its usual nighttime routine, indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding within its walls. Autumn evening slowly descended on the hospital garden. Allison stood at the window at the far end of the corridor, watching the last leaves fall from the almost bare trees. This place had become her favorite. Few people ever came here, and she had a good view of the nurses' station from around the corner. A light rain was falling outside, and the drops on the glass blurred the outlines of the hospital parking lot. Allison was about to return to the ward when she noticed a familiar figure. Dean was walking quickly across the courtyard, but instead of entering the main entrance, he turned toward the service entrance. Allison moved cautiously along the corridor. The station was empty. It was dinner time, and most of the staff had dispersed to the wards. Only the doctor's office was lit. The door was ajar, and voices could be heard clearly. Allison leaned against the wall around the corner, trying to breathe as quietly as possible. "Are you sure no one will notice the switch?" Dean's voice sounded alarmed. "Don't worry," Sandra said with her usual confidence. "I've done this before. The main thing is to adjust the readings correctly. Look, here's the original data from the lab, and here's what will be in her chart." The rustle of papers, the chair scraped across the floor. What if she asks for an independent examination? She won't. Sandra's voice took on a note of irritation. "You'll be here for a year, I guarantee it. By then you'll be done with the house." "Yes, about the house." Dean paused. "I've moved almost everything out, just the appliances and a few odds and ends." "What about the documents? The divorce papers are ready. I'll file next week while she's still here. It'll be easier that way." "Smart move," Sandra said softly. "You know, we're lucky she got sick right now. It's the perfect timing." The sound of a kiss, quiet laughter. "By the way, I got the keys to the new apartment," Sandra continued. "We can move in tomorrow. We just need to sort out her health insurance." "What do you mean?" "Well, since we're keeping her here, why not make the most of the situation? I know a couple of ways." Allison felt nausea rising in her throat. She heard footsteps in the hallway. Someone from the staff was returning from dinner. She carefully backed away toward her window. The rain intensified, turning the hospital courtyard into a blurry gray spot. Somewhere in the distance, cars were honking, and the sound seemed as unreal as the conversation she had overheard. In her robe pocket was her phone with the voice recorder turned on. Allison took it out with trembling hands and checked the recording. The voices were muffled, but the words were clear. In the evening, Melanie came in with an IV. Allison silently handed her the phone. "Here it is," whispered the intern after listening to the recording. "Now we have everything, the fake test results and the confession." "Do you think that's enough?" "For the chief physician, more than enough." Melanie adjusted the IV. "You know, my mom always says the worst thing isn't being betrayed, it's how methodically it's done." Outside, it was completely dark. The hospital was settling into its usual evening rhythm, muffled voices in the corridors, the rustling of medicine carts, the beeping of instruments in the distant wards. The lights were still on in the doctor's office. Allison imagined them sitting there, Dean and Sandra, poring over her medical chart, planning her future. I wonder what they're talking about right now. Maybe they're discussing what furniture to put in their new apartment. or deciding what else they can take from her and Dean's house while she's lying here trusting fake test results. It started raining again during the night. The raindrops drummed on the eaves, their sound blending with the ticking of the clock on the wall. Allison lay awake, listening to the monotonous melody and thinking about how strange life was. Sometimes you had to be locked in a hospital room to understand what was going on outside. Night nurses passed occasionally in the corridor, and someone in the next room moaned softly in their sleep. These were the usual hospital sounds that she had learned to distinguish. And somewhere among them were Sandra's footsteps, always confident, always purposeful. The footsteps of a person who, day after day, methodically built her happiness on the misfortune of others. The hospital corridor seemed unusually quiet in the early morning hours. Allison slowly made her way to the head doctor's office, leaning against the wall. She clutched an envelope with documents in her hands, test results, photographs, recordings of conversations. Melanie walked beside her, supporting her by the elbow. The sun barely filtered through the blinds on the windows, casting stripes of light and shadow across the floor. Somewhere deep inside the building, she could hear the familiar sounds of a hospital, the clinking of dishes in the cafeteria, the muffled voices of nurses, the shuffling of slippers on the tiled floor. Dr. Stevens, a heavy-set man with graying temples, listened intently as he shuffled through documents. His office smelled of coffee and medicine, and framed medical diplomas hung on the walls. "How long have you been gathering this evidence?" He took off his glasses and wiped them wearily with the corner of his coat. "About a week." Allison smoothed out a crease in her hospital gown. "At first, I just noticed discrepancies in the test results. Then, she fell silent as she heard familiar footsteps outside the door. The click of Sandra's heels passed by the office and faded away at the end of the corridor. "The forgery is particularly evident here." Melanie leaned over the table, pointing to the numbers in the documents. "Compare the figures in the original tests and in the patient's chart." The chief physician pored over the papers for a long time, frowning more and more. He turned on the voice recorder and listened to it twice. "You know," he leaned back in his chair, "in 30 years of work, I've seen it all. But like this. So methodical." Outside the window, a typical hospital day was beginning. Orderlies wheeled carts with clean linens. Nurses hurried with their morning procedures, and somewhere a phone rang insistently. "I have to check everything thoroughly." Dr. Stevens began to file the documents into a folder. "Leave it to me, and don't say a word to anyone." Heels clicked again in the hallway, closer this time. Sandra walked past the office, humming something to herself. Her perfume left a familiar trail in the air, the same scent that Allison had smelled so many times on her husband's shirts. The day dragged on slowly. Allison sat in her room, replaying the morning's conversation in her mind. A nurse came in with an IV, lunch was brought in, someone called on the phone. Everything was as usual, but now every sound, every movement seemed to be filled with special meaning. Towards evening, Melanie popped into the ward. "The chief physician is calling an emergency meeting. Sandra has been called to his office." "And Dean?" "He came by this afternoon. They talked in the doctor's office, discussing some documents. Then he left." The hallway was unusually busy. The staff was gathering at the nurse's station, talking in hushed voices. Fragments of phrases could be heard through the slightly ajar door. "It can't be. She always seemed so professional. And her husband is such a—" Allison closed her eyes. The image of Dean flashed before her eyes, just as she had seen him last. He had said something about renovations, about how everything was being done for her own good. And in his eyes there had been a strange mixture of guilt and impatience. In the evening, Dr. Stevens called. "Mrs. Harvey, I've checked all the documents. The official investigation will take place tomorrow morning. You will be asked to attend." "And Sandra?" "She has been suspended from work for the time being. And yes, we have contacted your attending physician. Based on the actual test results, you can indeed be discharged in the next few days. It was a moonless night. Outside the window, the last autumn leaves rustled, and somewhere in the distance, cars honked. Allison lay awake, listening to the familiar hospital sounds. Tomorrow, everything would change. Here in the hospital and there in the house she and Dean had shared, which he had methodically emptied while she lay here. The corridor was softly lit by night lamps, casting blurred shadows on the floor. Water dripped somewhere, and the night nurse's trolley creaked quietly as she pushed it along. The hospital was going about its usual nighttime routine, but now there was no familiar click of heels, no scent of Sandra's perfume, no sound of her confident voice at the nurse's station. The conference room on the third floor of the hospital was usually used for morning briefings and discussions of difficult cases. Now an unusual committee had gathered there. The chief physician, department heads, the hospital lawyer, and a representative of the medical workers' union. Allison sat by the window, watching them review documents and talk quietly among themselves. Melanie sat down next to her, nervously twisting the sleeve of her uniform. At the table, slightly apart from the others, sat Sandra, unusually pale but still impeccably groomed. The blinds were slightly open, and the autumn sun cast bright stripes across the floor. The usual hospital sounds could be heard in the hallway: footsteps, voices, the rustling of wheelchairs. It was a normal day, except that the atmosphere in the room was becoming increasingly tense. The chief physician carefully studied the medical records, comparing the original test results with those filed in the documents. The lawyer made notes in his notebook, occasionally exchanging glances with the union representative. "Miss Osborne," the chief physician's voice sounded tired, "can you explain these discrepancies in the documents?" Sandra smoothed out a crease in her skirt. "Perhaps there was some mistake in the paperwork. We have a lot of patients, and sometimes things get mixed up." "Mixed up?" The chief physician raised an eyebrow. "Is this also mixed up?" He turned on the tape recorder. Voices echoed through the quiet hall, talk of falsifying test results, plans to keep the patient in the hospital longer, and discussions about insurance. Sandra sat motionless, only her fingers clenching the handle of her purse turning white with tension. At that moment the door opened and Dean stood in the doorway. "Sorry I'm late," he said, walking over to an empty chair, carefully avoiding his wife's gaze. "I was called away on an emergency." "Yes, Mr. Harvey," the lawyer interrupted, tapping his pen on the table. "We were just discussing the situation with your wife's documents, or rather, their falsification." A ray of sunlight filtered through the blinds and fell on the table, illuminating the spread-out papers, original test results, copies with corrected numbers, and reports with forged signatures. "I think we all understand the seriousness of the situation." The chief physician took off his glasses and rubbed his nose wearily. "Falsification of medical documents, illegal detention of patients, insurance fraud." Heels clicked in the hallway again. One of the nurses was rushing to attend to her duties. The sound, so similar to Sandra's footsteps, made her flinch. The meeting lasted several hours. The lawyer read out the charges, the union representative objected, and the department heads looked through the documents, shaking their heads. Allison looked out the window at the hospital courtyard where orderlies were hanging laundry, nurses were rushing about, and cars were coming and going. Normal hospital life went on, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the conference room. By evening, it was all over. Sandra was suspended from work pending an internal investigation. The chief physician said something about forwarding the materials to the appropriate authorities, about possible revocation of her license, about legal consequences. Dean sat silently in his corner, avoiding looking at his wife. When everyone began to leave, he tried to approach Sandra, but the lawyer stopped him. "Mr. Harvey, You'd better refrain from contacting Miss Osborne until the investigation is complete. The hallway was unusually quiet. Allison slowly made her way to her room, leaning against the wall. Twilight was falling outside the windows, and the lights in the hospital garden were coming on. Somewhere in the distance, an ambulance siren could be heard, reminding her that life goes on, with all its illnesses and recoveries, dramas and routines. In the evening, Melanie stopped by with an IV. You know, Sandra didn't even apologize. She just packed her things and left. She didn't even say goodbye to anyone. In the hallway, nurses were handing out dinner. It smelled like hospital food and medicine. The usual evening sounds, only now there was no familiar click of heels, no confident voices at the nurses' station, no smell of expensive perfume. The last autumn leaves still remained in the hospital garden, bright spots against the gray sky. Allison was sitting on her favorite bench under the maple tree when she saw Dean approaching. He walked slowly, his hands in his jacket pockets as he always did when he was nervous. He sat down next to her without looking at her. He smelled of machine oil and fatigue. He must have come straight from the workshop. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind rustling in the treetops. "Why did you do that?" His voice sounded hollow. "You could have just talked to me. Would you have listened?" In the hospital courtyard, an orderly was pushing an empty stretcher. Somewhere above, a window slammed and a gust of wind blew several leaves off a maple tree. They swirled slowly in the air before falling to the damp ground. "I did everything for you." Dean rubbed his nose. "You said yourself that you were tired of our house, of all the old things." "When did I say that?" "Last year, or the year before. It doesn't matter." He waved his hand. "The main thing is, I wanted what was best. New renovations, new furniture. A new life? With Sandra?" He flinched as if he had been slapped. A young couple with a child appeared in the hospital garden, apparently visiting one of the patients. The toddler jumped up and down, trying to catch the falling leaves, and his laughter sounded out of place in the gray autumn silence. "Listen," Dean leaned closer. "Let's talk about this calmly. I can explain everything. Sandra, it was just a coincidence. We didn't mean to hurt you. So you decided to fake the test results? To keep me in the hospital while you set up your love nest?" "No, it's not like that." He ran his hand through his hair. "We were really worried about your health. Sandra said that with symptoms like that, you needed to rest longer. And the move, well, I thought it would be easier. For everyone." A nurse approached the bench. Not Melanie, but another one she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Harvey, it's time for your treatment." "I'll take her," Dean said, standing up and holding out his hand. "No, it's okay." The hallway smelled of medicine and bleach. They walked in silence, Allison in front, holding onto the wall, Dean 2 steps behind, as if hesitating to get closer. "You know," he stopped at the door to the ward, "I really did love you. It's just that everything changed." "Yes, especially the numbers in my test results." Outside, it started raining again. The drops drummed on the eaves, creating a monotonous background noise. Somewhere deep inside the ward, a phone rang insistently. Nurses were delivering lunch, and the smell of hospital soup and damp autumn filled the air. "Allison," Dean took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Maybe it's not too late to fix things? I'll talk to the chief physician, explain about the tests. I'll say it was a mistake. Was the apartment on Maple Street a mistake too? And the forged signature on the resignation letter?" He recoiled as if struck. "How did you—" "It doesn't matter now." She turned toward the door. "You'd better leave, Dean, and tell Sandra to get ready for an investigation. I think the medical board will be very interested in her methods." "Wait," he grabbed her arm. "Let's at least talk. I'll explain everything, tell you how it all happened." "How did what happen? Forging documents, stealing things from the house, or your plans for my insurance?" Melanie appeared in the hallway with an IV. Seeing them, she froze for a second, then headed decisively toward the room. "Mr. Harvey, you can't be here. Visiting hours are over." Dean slowly unclenched his fingers. He stood there for another second, looking at his wife as if he wanted to say something. Then he turned and walked toward the exit, hunched over, shoulders slumped, looking nothing like the confident man he had been just a week ago. Evening was falling on the hospital, turning the windows dark blue. The ward was quiet and cool. Melanie silently set up the IV, glancing sideways at the patient. "You know," she finally said, "my mom says sometimes you just have to let go. No explanations, no excuses, just let go and move on." Rain was falling outside the window. Nurses were talking in the hallway, instruments were clanging, and wheelchairs were rustling. The usual hospital sounds that had become so familiar over the past few weeks. The morning of her discharge was unexpectedly sunny. Allison packed her few belongings into her bag: books, a robe, slippers, and the warm scarf Melanie had given her. Outside the window, the last autumn leaves rustled, and in their rustling she heard something disturbing and at the same time hopeful. The hospital routine went on as usual. Breakfast was being delivered somewhere in the hallway. The familiar voices of nurses could be heard, and instruments clattered. Everything was as usual, only now these sounds were no longer part of her life. Melanie helped her get ready, repeatedly adjusting her crooked hat. "Let me call a taxi. It's not very far to your house, but still, home." It felt strange to think about it after so many weeks in the hospital. What would it be like now after Dean had taken away almost all the furniture? What was left of their former life? The taxi was waiting at the main entrance. The driver, an elderly man with kind eyes, helped her put her bag in the trunk. Melanie stood on the porch, fingering the sleeve of her uniform. "Call me if you need anything. You have my number, right?" The city outside the car window seemed unfamiliar, even though it had only been a few weeks. There were new signs. The last leaves had fallen from the trees, and people were wrapped up in winter coats. Autumn was firmly setting in. The house greeted her with a hollow silence. Allison stood in the hallway for a long time, not daring to go further. Finally, gathering her courage, she pushed open the door to the living room. It was empty, bare walls with lighter rectangles where pictures had been hung. The wallpaper was torn in the corner. Dean had apparently started renovating but hadn't finished. There were marks on the floor where furniture had been moved, and the air smelled slightly of construction dust. No sofas, no armchairs, no coffee table. The bookshelves had disappeared along with the books. Only the dowels remained in the walls, silent witnesses to what had once been a cozy nest. Their shared nest. A forgotten flower stood alone on the windowsill in a clay pot, a small pelargonium that they had bought at the flower market in the spring. Somehow, it was still blooming, stubbornly throwing bright pink blossoms into the emptiness of the room. The kitchen looked a little better. The cabinets and stove were still there. But all the little things that made this place feel alive were gone. The ceramic mugs, the collection of magnets on the refrigerator, the old coffee maker they had bought in their first year of marriage. The bedroom was empty and echoey. The bed remained, huge and now seeming absurd in the empty room. A piece of paper lay on the floor. Allison picked it up. It was a receipt from a furniture store dated last week. Apparently, Dean had already furnished his new apartment. She slowly walked around the house, noting the absence of familiar things. All the photographs were gone. Wedding photos, vacation photos, school albums. The souvenirs they had brought back from their travels were gone. Even the old blanket her grandmother had knitted was gone. The study was bare. Only the desk remained, and it had no drawers. The computer was gone, along with the printer and stacks of school materials. There was a mark on the wall where the calendar had been, a rectangle of lighter wallpaper. The front door creaked. Someone had put the key in the lock. Allison froze, listening. She heard familiar footsteps in the hallway. "You're already here?" Dean stopped at the door to the study. "I thought they'd discharge you later. They decided I'm healthy enough." He shifted from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable in the empty house. "I wanted to finish the repairs. And the move." "Allison, don't." She raised her hand. "Just tell me what else you plan to take." He looked around as if seeing the results of his work for the first time. The appliances, I guess, and a few other things. "Things," she echoed. "Our life has turned into things that can just be taken away." Outside, it started raining again. The raindrops drummed on the eaves, just like at the hospital, only here the sound seemed louder, clearer. In the empty house, all the sounds were different. "I'll leave you the keys," Dean said, placing the bunch on the empty table. "And the house documents. It's always been in your name, so thanks for your concern." He stood there for a moment as if he wanted to add something. Then he turned and walked toward the door. His footsteps echoed hollowly in the empty rooms. The front door slammed shut, and the house was silent again. Allison went to the window. The forgotten geranium was still blooming on the windowsill, the only living thing in this realm of emptiness. The law office was located in an old brick building overlooking a park. Allison sat in a comfortable leather chair, staring at the fallen leaves outside the window while the lawyer looked through the documents. "So," Robert Cohen put the folder aside, "we have evidence of tampering with medical records. We have the hospital commission's report. And we have a list of items that were removed from the house without your consent." On the table were photos of their living room, before and after. Allison remembered taking those pictures a year ago, not suspecting that they would become evidence in a divorce case. "Sandra was fired from the hospital," she said, running her finger along the edge of the table. "It seems there's some kind of investigation into her medical license." "That'll work in our favor," Cohen noted in his notebook, "as will the attempted insurance fraud. Now let's take a look at the list of items you want back." Allison took out a folded piece of paper. She had spent several days compiling this list, remembering every meaningful item from their past life. Her grandmother's blanket, a collection of old records, photo albums, books with notes in the margins. Children were playing in the park outside the window. Their laughter could be heard even through the closed windows. The autumn was surprisingly warm, as if nature was trying to compensate people for all their losses and disappointments. Your ex-husband has agreed to negotiate," Cohen said, looking over the list. "I think he understands that it's better to settle this peacefully." Dean called a week later. They met in a small cafe near her house, now hers alone. He looked haggard with dark circles under his eyes. "Here," he said, placing the garage keys on the table. "Everything I took out is there. You can take whatever you want." The garage smelled of motor oil and dust. Things were piled up haphazardly: books, albums, dishes. In the corner stood their old sofa, covered with boxes of photographs and documents. "What about the rest?" Allison looked around the room. "Where's Grandma's blanket? Where are the records?" "In the apartment. I'll bring them." He looked away. "Tomorrow." She methodically sorted through the things, putting what she wanted to keep into separate boxes. Books that remembered their first years together, photo albums preserving happy moments, the ones that were real, an old coffee maker that had faithfully brewed their morning coffee for so many years. Dean kept his word and brought the rest the next day. The blanket was in a dry cleaning bag, and the records were neatly packed in a box. "You know," he hesitated in the doorway, "Sandra left. Right after she got fired. She didn't even say goodbye." Allison said nothing, looking at the envelopes with the records. Their first dance at the wedding was to one of them, an old ballad about love and fidelity. It's funny how the meaning of songs changes over time. The house gradually came to life. New furniture took the place of the old, different but just as cozy. New paintings appeared on the walls, new books on the shelves. Only her grandmother's blanket remained the same, lying on the new sofa, preserving the warmth of the past. Allison sorted through the rescued photographs, wondering which ones to keep. She decided to keep some, not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder that everything in life changes, even if it seems eternal. She was warmly welcomed at school. Her colleagues delicately avoided questions but surrounded her with care and attention. New teaching materials were already on her desk. Someone had taken care of it in advance. In the evenings, she sat in her redecorated living room listening to old records on a new record player. Outside the window, the familiar city evening bustled, and the lights came on in the park across the street.